At college, I studied with a professor who was dedicated to bearing witness to the genocide in Rwanda. And while I was very moved by his work, at the time I had no spiritual beliefs or framework, and so I fell into some personal distress. I often wondered, how is it that people can create such horrific suffering for each other repeatedly throughout the course of history? And at the same time, I was in a relationship that was turning quite sour, and we were fighting every day. And so I wondered, how is it that two people who claim to love each other, can't even get along day to day? What hope is there for world peace? And so those were some of the questions I was carrying in my heart when I began a spiritual search for some kind of belief or refuge, And I will say 20 years on, I feel I have definitely found those answers in Buddhism. And that came especially clear to me on this recent trip to Bodh Gaya. And so I'd like to share some things that happened there. So we had the wonderful opportunity to stay with the Vietnamese Sangha for about a week when we were in Bodh Gaya. When I was at the Bhikshuni Varsa in Sravasti this past summer, I made friends with the Vietnamese translator. Her name is Venerable Diu Hai. She's quite a remarkable practitioner, and her life is probably the subject of a whole different talk. But in any case, she founded a temple in Bodh Gaya. And many, many Vietnamese monastics go there on pilgrimage, they come and go. And when we were there, they welcomed us like family. It was so nice to live with them. And so on Posada Day, when we confess and repent and renew our precepts, we asked them, what are you going to do? And they said, the Vietnamese Sangha, we alternate between reciting the Bhikshu Bhikshuni precepts once every 2 weeks, right? And then after that, we also recite the Bodhisattva precepts. We alternate between the two. So it happened that when we were there, they were going to recite the Bodhisattva precepts. So all the Vietnamese monastics in Bodh Gaya were going to gather at the Great Stupa, at this big piece of land where they were also reciting the Mahayana Sutras in Vietnamese day to day. And so unfortunately at that time, Venerable Children had caught a cold. And she said, the recitation is at 6 in the morning when it's fairly cold. It's not a good idea for me to risk it and make the cold worse. But she said, I would so much like to recite the Bodhisattva precepts with the Vietnamese Sangha. It would be so meaningful for me to do something virtuous with the Vietnamese, especially because of everything the US has done to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. So her saying this really struck me. And that was very much on my mind when Venerable Konchok and I went to join the Vietnamese Sangha at the Great Stupa. We don't understand any Vietnamese, but I recognize parts of the ritual from the Chinese tradition. And as we sat there, just being with the Vietnamese Sangha at the Great Stupa, I just kept thinking about what it means to be with a group of people intent on virtue. Who are intent on generating this most amazing of minds to become fully awakened. And how different that is when compared to when we get together with people to make war or to make money or, all the other things that people get together to do. So it was a very beautiful morning. And then a few days later, the Vietnamese Sangha requested Venerable to give a Q&A session. And again, because she was not well, I didn't want to schedule a lot of talks or, meetings. So we invited friends who wanted to meet with her to come to the Q&A. So there were Westerners, and there was also a Tibetan nun. She was one of the Tibetan nuns who had escaped by foot and gone gone to help build a nunnery in Dharamsala. Her name is Geshe-ma Delek Wangmo. She's among the first batch of Geshe-mas. And if I'm not wrong, she's also the first Tibetan nun to serve in the Tibetan government on the electoral committee. And so she very much wanted to hear what a Western nun had to say. And so she came for that Q&A session. And toward the end of the Q&A, she asked a question, and she said, I can hear from what you've shared that you've practiced very deeply. What are your thoughts on creating world peace? And Venerable went, whew. And if I recall correctly, I do believe the recording's online, she talked about how basically we live in cyclic existence. That war, violence, this kind of gross suffering is part of the nature of cyclic existence. So realistically speaking, the most important thing is for us to identify the root causes of cyclic existence and to strive to uproot those causes in our minds, right? To get out of cyclic existence and to help others do the same. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that, we kind of withdraw from this life that we're in. We do our best to create the causes for virtue as we practice, especially with the people, the communities, the societies we're connected to. But if our efforts in this life do not seem to bear fruit immediately, that's not a cause for distress or to give up. Yeah, we do what we can, but we always keep our mind on the long-term goal of full awakening. So she said that. And then because we were going to light candles for peace after this Q&A, and make prayers for peace in the world, then Venerable said, on behalf of my country, I would like to apologize to the Vietnamese Sangha for everything that the US has done in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And then, and after a while, the abbess of the temple replied, my dear Venerable, there's no need to apologize. There's no fault. We also have to take into account the collective karma of the Vietnamese people. And then after that, we moved on to lighting these lamps for peace. And people came up to make offerings to Venerable at that time, and you could see the Vietnamese were deeply moved by what she had said. And I noticed out of a corner of my eye, there was a quite elderly nun who was just sobbing. She was sobbing and sobbing. We were trying to give her candles, and she was just overcome with emotion. And then later on, she said, through the translator, please tell Venerable Children, thank you for what she said about the war. I think for me, just witnessing these three senior nuns and that exchange made me feel like, wow, these are people who've dedicated their lives to peace. They've really worked with the sufferings they've witnessed and experienced and come to this place of deep compassion within them. That's what I felt about the whole evening. When they spoke, there was no anger, there was no distress. But yeah, just this very deep understanding of how things are and a sense of compassion and forgiveness and love. And just watching them, I just sat there and thought, I have totally made the right decision with my life. I'm so happy that I ordained. And then there were fireworks at the very end. Yes, we made prayers for peace. And then the abbess said, oh yeah, these young Vietnamese monks, they love setting off fireworks. And true enough, some of them on the ground floor were setting off fireworks, which kind of terrified us on the fourth floor. Yeah, but it was really, for me, a very magical ending to a very, very meaningful evening. And one of the most precious memories I'll carry with me from our trip this time.